as Kemal already mentioned, the goal of this actual presentation is more to show the Scrum in its light as something that's being used in daily practice in real world, in trenches, and what the actual issues are that development teams face on daily basis when they are working with different kind of in different kind of environments, whether it's a customer oriented environment or whether it's in your own company. So as with all of the other presenters before, I first have to extend the thanks to all of our sponsors for this event. And here is my contact information in case anybody wants to reach out at any time after this lecture for any additional information. So we can begin. The content of this presentation, because we are going to be talking about the Scrum, first part is actually going to be a relatively quick rundown of what Scrum is and some of the definitions and terms of Scrum before we actually tackle the topic of what the challenges of daily usage of Scrum are. So, what is Scrum? Definition from actual Scrum guide says a framework within which people can address complex adaptive problems while productively and creatively delivering products of the highest possible value. One thing that's really important to mention here is framework. It's not a methodology, it's a framework. And one of the reasons is actually what Scott pointed out this morning. Blind believers in full implementation when it doesn't really fit will give the entire framework sort of a bad name and bad reputation. So there is actually a, sort of an old joke about methodologists, and methodology says what is the difference between methodologist and terrorist? You can negotiate with terrorists. There's no negotiation with methodologists. So, key points for the Scrum. It is really lightweight. It is as light as it can be while still offering a framework to actually introduce Agile into something that's really suited for our markets, because we are young and emerging market in software industry, and using Scrum as a framework to actually introduce Agile into your environment is probably as good choice as any other. It is simple to understand, but it is difficult to master. And that's where the catch actually lies. As any other process that goes into complex environments, Scrum is difficult to apply, especially if you do it always by the book. So the Scrum framework consists of Scrum teams and their roles, events, artifacts, and rules. We're going to talk a bit about what Scrum teams are, what roles are, what events are, what artifacts are. We are going to skip rules somewhat for this presentation because it would take pretty much too long. So, theory. Again, a couple of lectures this morning actually mentioned it. The entire Agile is based on empirical process control theory. So, it's the same with the Scrum. Three pillars of empirical process: transparency, inspection, and adaptation. Transparency is really, really important in Scrum as in any other Agile framework or process, just because without it you cannot, what it actually means is that pretty much everyone involved in the process should be on the same terms, use the same terminology, have the same agreement on what, for example, done means. Otherwise, you're going to get misunderstandings and you're going to get in problems. The other two are standard pillars, and they are mostly addressed in Scrum by artifacts and events such as sprint planning, and especially sprint retrospective session. So, Scrum team consists of 3 roles, and only 3 roles: product owner, Scrum master, and the development team. Product owner is usually, essentially you can have multiple Scrum teams working on the same project and or on the same product actually, but there can only be one product owner. It is the person with these primary roles, clearly expressing product backlog items, ordering them or prioritizing them in whichever way they actually feel is the best. So either by value or by time of execution or by compliance priority or whatever it is. One of the most important actual roles that defines product owner is the value optimizer. Pretty much the entire goal of the product owner is to optimize the value of work that development team does in order to get the most bang for the buck, essentially for the company. The second note is essentially part about transparency. Product backlog needs to be visible and transparent and clear to all, because stakeholders need to know what is on the priority list. Stakeholders need to know what's going to be worked on next. And finally, ensuring that the development team understands item in product backlog to the level needed. Essentially, if you don't know what you need to do, how can you do it? Development team. Two key properties for the development team: self-organizing and cross-functional. Apart from sort of classical methods where you have strictly defined roles of developer, business analyst, quality assurance engineer, or analyst, in Scrum, that all actually comes down into the same team. So teams need to be able to deliver. By definition, again, teams need to be able to deliver the potentially shippable increment of done. Potentially shippable is something that, again, Scott referred to this morning as sort of a nonsense. But what it really means is just that whatever comes out of work that Scrum team actually delivers is something that can go into production if deemed fit by the product owner. Scrum Master, three primary roles within the company: servicing product owner, development team, and organization. So, as far as Scrum events are concerned, what we have is the sprint. It's a time box, mostly 1 week to 4 weeks, never more, never less. Usually teams, pretty much, I believe around 60 or 70% teams use 2-week sprints, during which a done, usable, and potentially releasable product increment is created. What this means is developed, tested to a point where it's actually good enough to go into production if needed. Sprint planning, planning session or meeting that actually has 3 distinct parts. What can be done this sprint, how will the chosen work get done, and the sprint goal. What can be done this sprint is essentially solely the responsibility of development team within a sprint planning meeting. So not the Scrum team, the development team. Before we go into the sprint planning meeting, priorities need to be set by product owner. Development team has an exclusive right to actually forecast what they can implement and what they can accomplish in accordance to their definition of done. Part 2 is how will the chosen work get done? That's more or less a technical discussion. How to implement stuff that you already determined that you can do within that sprint. That is again solely the development team. Only the part 3, sprint goal, actually also involves product owner, because sprint goal is something that is determined in conjunction between development team and product owner, and is actually pretty much the only thing that is set within the sprint and unchangeable. Changing the sprint goal is mostly something that would essentially lead to the premature termination of the sprint. Not really an occurrence that happens often. For example, on one of our previous training sessions with a certified Scrum Master and trainer, Ralph Jocham, we asked him the same question. In his 20 plus years of experience as a Scrum Master, how many times did he have a termination of sprint? The answer was 2 in over 25 years. One was when they actually, in the middle of the sprint, lost the project and terminated all of the work on it. And the second was when they, in the middle of the sprint, discovered a fundamental flaw in business requirements on which all of the previous iterations were built. So there was no point in continuing until that flaw was analyzed and removed. Daily Scrum meeting, again, referred to as something very simple. What it is a sort of common misconception that daily Scrums need to be attended by the entire Scrum team. Essentially, the only people required on the daily Scrum are development team. Not even a Scrum Master is actually required to attend every daily Scrum. Each development team member needs to answer these 3 questions. And they are all pretty much team-oriented and sprint goal-oriented. What did I do yesterday? What will I do today? And is there anything preventing me from completing my work or preventing the team from achieving the sprint goal? Next in line of Scrum events is sprint review session. The sprint review session, pretty much end of sprint, something that happens where the entire team, especially the product owner, actually demonstrate what has been done to the stakeholders. One of the most important things about this sprint review session is actually that out of the all of the Scrum artifacts and Scrum events, it is the only event that actually brings together stakeholders and the development team. No other. All of the others are actually solely for the Scrum team. So this is the only place where development team actually has pretty much face-to-face, at least formally, every sprint with the stakeholders, where they can see their reactions to work they've done, hear their comments directly instead of through the proxy that is essentially a product owner, and get more feel of where the entire product is going, because this session is also where stakeholders and product owner together with the development team have some discussions on the future of the product and what's going to be done next. So, sprint retrospective. This event is actually very often completely skipped by the teams that claim to do Scrum, or at least some sort of Scrum, because it is essentially an internal event for the team, but it has huge importance in means that it is actually something where it is one place where the entire Scrum team analyzes what they've done as far as how they did the work in the previous sprint or in the previous iterations, and determine what are the areas of potential improvement, as well as actually analyze if they implemented any of the potential improvements from previous iterations. It's sort of a feedback loop for itself for the development team to figure out what they can do better, what they did wrong, and how to get better with this. As far as artifacts go, product backlog is pretty much a product inventory. Something that the product owner is responsible for solely, and we'll talk about it later. It's one of the big potential flaws in the entire process. And essentially it lists all features, functions, requirements, enhancements, and fixes that need to be made to the product by priority that is defined by product owner. input of development team into product backlog, of course, is always there. Development team themselves can propose to product owner adding new stuff to the backlog, especially technical items that don't really bring direct business value, but are necessary in order for product to be successful. And also, one of the big things that is somewhat neglected by teams often is that actual product backlog, as the colleague before said, grooming, essentially recently renamed to refinement. That is one place where, or it's more or less a continual process where development team works with product owner to get stuff on product backlog clearer. Higher up on the priority list something is, it needs to be more clear. Because essentially, when you get to a point where that product backlog is considered for the sprint planning, nothing that is high enough to go into the sprint should be more than, it should be at a higher level than it can actually be delivered in a sprint. Preferably even smaller, as small as it makes sense. Because that will actually enable you to do more precise forecasting and to deliver. Sprint backlog, most important thing about it, it's essentially a set of product backlog items that were selected for the sprint, plus a plan for the delivering product and realizing that sprint goal that we talked about. Another thing that is really often neglected is this definition of done. This is what tends to get development teams in quite a lot of trouble with product owners and stakeholders. Definition of done is something that needs to be common pretty much across the organization. Everybody involved in the process needs to agree what done means. For the standard developer, especially in the traditional method, done is usually when they are done with the code and they check it into source control. In Scrum process, that is usually when it's actually ready to go into production. So you've done the work, somebody's tested it according to test cases, it's been signed off, it looks good, it can go into production. Obviously, those two things have quite a different level of effort included with them, and potentially even different number of resources involved, different number of people. So that was a brief overview of what the development team, what Scrum actually entails of. Now we can have a small discussion on what the challenges are for the development team when working within this environment. And within this discussion, please feel free to raise a hand at any point in time and ask a question. We can have a more formal Q&A session at the end, but this can be more of an open discussion than long lecture. So, development teams. This is again a definition of development team as we saw it before. Those two main properties of the development team. What are the internal challenges for the development team in implementing Scrum? Cross-functionality. That's the first thing that often lacks in the development teams. As we already mentioned, the entire Scrum team that is supposed to be able to deliver the increment of product is actually consists only of product owner, development team, and Scrum Master. This means that any more detailed business analysis than product owner can provide needs to be done by the development team. All of the development work needs to be done by the development team. Architectural work, any architectural spikes, any decisions, development team needs to be able to do that on its own. Testing also. So cross-functionality tends to be a relatively big challenge for the entire process, because development teams in traditional model usually consist of developers only. Now we are talking about mixing different roles, and the thing about it is ideally in Scrum every member of the team should be able to do everything. Realistically, of course, that's not always possible, or almost never. Self-organizing, pretty much the same thing. Self-organization of the teams requires quite a lot. Requires some level of experience and maturity to the team that often doesn't really exist. Requires the team to be able to work efficiently without supervision, without a lot of supervision at least. There is no formal team lead role or anything like that. So it is a challenge. Of course, as we already mentioned, it's a framework. It's free to adapt as you're willing to and to meet your needs. So it's not a methodology, nobody needs to follow it really blindly. Adhering to definition of done. As I already mentioned, definition of done usually means in Scrum, developed and tested, ready for production. For developers, that is, for developer mentality actually, especially for people coming out of traditional model, that tends to be quite hard to grasp. And actually, they tend to drop all of the work apart from development that is required from their forecasts, from the estimations. And also, one of the bigger challenges is developers, well, we all want to work on coding for the entire sprint. Or here, right here, that is not really what's possible to do. Just because anything that you code in the entire sprint needs to be tested in that same sprint. So that means that you cannot really deliver code on the last day of the sprint to your colleague from the development team, have 5 developers dump a lot of code on one guy or 2 guys and expect everything to be tested and signed off. If it's not tested and signed off, it's not done. On a retrospective or anything, it counts as if you haven't done the work. Yeah, go ahead.
Just for the definition of done, each sprint we have to deliver an increment, usable increment.
Potentially shippable.
Yeah, potentially shippable. Does that mean it has to be marked as done?
Because
when you say production, ready, that could be 2 months after the sprint.
When something goes into production is a decision exclusively made by product owner. Product owner can make a determination to ship every sprint as an increment into production. He can collect 2, 4, 6, whatever number of sprints he wants. That shouldn't really matter as much to the development team as far as process goes, because as far as development team is concerned, work they did in a sprint, if it's marked as done, it's ready to go. It's been tested, it's been signed off.
Can developer actually, can we assume something is done? The developer claims it's done and he claims it's bug free, but it's not yet gone through all the cycles of testing.
The meaning or notion of formal cycles of testing in Scrum is kind of different, because testing is again a responsibility of the development team. So if you have, for example, a system that has a formal QA environment where stuff needs to be deployed in order to be signed off, that essentially means that in order to mark something as done within a sprint, it needs to be deployed into that environment, needs to be tested in that environment by somebody from development team. If development team has a dedicated person that does that, fine. If not, then test cases are actually being checked by the developers themselves in accordance to the acceptance criteria and non-functional requirements.
What about the user acceptance testing?
User acceptance testing can or but may not be a part of definition of done. It's up to the specific company that does the implementation. Formal UAT is actually, at least for these small increments, because sprint is a relatively small increment, 2 weeks or 3 weeks of development usually. Formal UAT is more and more being omitted by the companies from practice altogether. The sort of an equivalent to it, but not true equivalent, is the actual review session, because end of sprint on that review session, all of the relevant stakeholders actually get to see the product in action demonstrated by the product owner. So if it looks good to them at that point in time, it sort of counts usually as accepted by users.
I do have 2 questions. One,
Sure.
who is resolving the conflicts in case of conflicts inside the team, because the team should be self-organizing? This is one question.
Okay.
And my other question is, there's a product owner who is most probably, or she, from the business side, right?
Okay.
From the needs of the business. And most of the time, enterprises, inside the enterprises, they are not tended to allocate let's say, good business guy from either from the marketing department or operations department, depending on the project, to an ongoing agile project, and most probably there will be one product owner. But the business needs are quite large. And in software development projects, most of the time they are collapsing down or delaying because of the poor business analysis or scope creeping.
Okay.
So product owner is working as a bridge between the business entities and the project. Is it working like that? Or are they taking the responsibility of the whole requirements while we are defining definition of done? Because
Okay.
he or she is the responsible.
Okay. Okay, let me first address the first question. Since we are talking about self-organizing teams, it really depends. If team can be fully self-organizing, they should be able to resolve conflicts on their own. Of course, in reality, that will not always be the case. So if every company has some sort of governance over the HR, so if there are real conflicts that cannot be resolved within the team, that's where human resources or somebody else within the company hierarchy steps in. But the better development teams get at self-organizing, they are usually given more freedom. So there is actually a tendency by some managers within companies that have more experience with Scrum and Agile and have more experienced teams to even hand over stuff like hiring new people or interviewing and decision making on who to hire for as a team member to the actual team, because those are the people that are going to be working with somebody, so who's better to say who to work with than them. As far as the other question is concerned, there is really no good answer to it. Product owner is supposed to be a true bridge between all of the business stakeholders and the team. He is the one person that's solely responsible for maintaining a backlog and priorities. If that guy is not doing a good job, that's something that will bring the entire project down if not addressed correctly. Because as I mentioned earlier, one of the primary roles, if not primary role of product owner, is to be value optimizer. So if a product owner is not managing the backlog correctly, not managing the priorities of stakeholders correctly, then there is no value being produced. Development team may do a crack job at implementing whatever was planned. It doesn't really bring value to the company. So if they don't want to get a guy that's good enough to do it, then it's essentially the client's risk at failing. Risk of failing at delivery of the entire product is increasing drastically, and that's all you can do. I mean, Okay. Frequent team changes. Empirically, one of the pieces of information that surprised me, but has been sort of proven empirically, is that if you have if you have a team that works well together for a long time, a couple of years or something like that, runs like a well-oiled machine, and you change one member of that team, you can cause a short-term drop in productivity of up to 50% for the entire team. So Scrum doesn't really forbid changes to the teams, but by definition, it should be done only when necessary, and it should be done by taking into account a short-term drop in productivity. Team members pretty much covers the grounds of a question a colleague asked. What about people that don't have skill sets, or what about people that don't get along well together? Something that can be a problem, something that needs to be dealt with, otherwise the entire team and the entire process will suffer. The other big part of potential problem, organizational mentality. If organization is not really adopting Scrum at all levels, then we have a big problem. For example, you may have a case like I actually had of a client that has a CIO, Chief Information Officer, being a top stakeholder for the entire project, who has a development background from like 25 years ago, something in COBOL. And you end up with a guy who lives in conviction that anybody doing anything different than what's been done 25 years ago is crazy. How do you deal with that? That is a big danger. That's something that product owner then really needs to step up, be good, and deal with. Also, that's one of the primary roles of Scrum Master that's often being neglected. Scrum Master is a person who is supposed to do the most in the entire process in actually training the entire organization, including product owner and stakeholders, in adopting the process and getting stuff done correctly. If they cannot do the job well, then the entire process is a danger. Influences outside of Scrum Team, pretty much the same thing. Yes, it is sort of a stupid notion that you say Scrum Master is supposed to shield the team from all outside influences completely. But also, some of the outside influences must be stopped. If stakeholders are meddling in the Scrum Team's work day in and day out, you'll get scope creep, you'll get changes, nothing will be planned properly, nothing will be executed properly. In the end, you won't get anywhere with the product. Insufficient transparency. Again, if backlog is not clear to everybody, including stakeholders, if something is being hidden by stakeholders from others, if they are not fully transparent in their intentions and their priorities and what they need, what the product needs to be, then product owner cannot do his job well. Consequently, product will not turn up well. Insufficient feedback. Again, Scrum, as anything agile, is fully empirical and depends on feedback. If business users don't provide feedback, then you don't know how well you did, and you might be doing things wrong. You might be doing good things, but at a bad time. And again, definition of done. Product owner. These are the responsibilities that we already saw for the product owner. If any of these is not being done right, Scrum team, development team is actually in problems. Scrum Master. Earlier, we did not actually elaborate on individual responsibilities of Scrum Master. We just mentioned the service to product owner, service to development team, and service to the organization. Here are the key points for the organization. Leading and coaching in Scrum adoption. If this is not being done, then we end up with some of the issues from the previous slide. Planning Scrum implementations with the organization. Helping employees and stakeholders understand and enact Scrum and empirical product development. Causing change that increases the productivity. All of these things are responsibilities that Scrum Master needs to take care of. Unfortunately, ever so often, Scrum Master is being considered pretty much no more than a glorified secretary, somebody who writes down, burn down charts and data and reports and nothing else. But he should be a lot more than that. As far as development team is concerned, this is probably the key point. Removing the impediments. Anything that the development team identifies during the sprint as something that may be an impediment that will keep them from achieving the sprint goal. Scrum Master is the one who should be working on removing it. Whether he has to work with the product owner on that or somebody else outside of the Scrum team is more or less irrelevant. Challenges as far as these sessions or events are concerned. Daily Scrum. People tend to talk too much. Daily Scrum is supposed to be time boxed at 15 minutes max. The purpose of this meeting is only to answer those 3 questions. What did I do yesterday? What will I do today? And are there any impediments or anything blocking me? Any technical discussions or anything like that are outside of the scope and shouldn't be dealt on this meeting. Sprint planning, big forecasting. One of the big sort of problems again for the development team. Being able to accurately estimate something, to provide a forecast of when something is going to be done is a kind of science of its own. It takes a lot of understanding of both development methodologies and tools, of domain model, of complexity of issues at hand, stuff that needs to be done. And if you fail at this, you may fail at your sprint goal. So it's something that is pretty much experience-based. The more you work and the more you work within the same domain model, the better you will be at this. Interesting thing about this is that until 2011, actually the Scrum Guide had the forecast. It wasn't actually, term used wasn't forecasting, it was commitment. Estimation and commitment. So at 2011 they changed it because commitment turned out to be too harsh of a word. That was usually something that was sort of abused by stakeholders to actually hold the development team accountable for the delivery of something that is unpredictable to a degree. So you can only do a forecast and everybody needs to be aware of it. Sprint goal, again, establishing a good sprint goal, it can be hard. Sprint review, quality of review sessions. If review sessions are not being done well, they are useless and can actually lead to tension between development team or entire Scrum team and stakeholders and endanger the entire product. Retrospective. Have we learned our lessons? Have we implemented what we agreed? So that would be pretty it. And are there any questions? Sure.
I think one of the major challenges, at least for me,
Yeah.
is What about distributed, co-located teams? Actually, we have projects that are covered by teams from different countries, and especially if the teams are in different time zones, then it's pretty hard to maintain agile.
Yeah, as one of the slides from Scott this morning showed, that's one of the levels of complexity, geographical distribution. It's easy when you're co-located, when everybody's sitting in the same room without any walls, cubicles, or anything like that. If you are geographically distributed, you need to use the technology a bit more just to get across those hurdles. You cannot do a stand-up, but you can do a phone conference call of 15 minutes to handle these issues. Being in different time zones can be a challenge, but can actually, if done properly, can be turned into a decent, fairly good thing, because what you can end up with is essentially the same team, almost a 24-hour cycle of development.
Yeah, but if you're working on sprint retrospective or planning,
yes, some sort of overlap needs to. I mean, I'm in the same situation. I have teams that actually work with 9-hour difference, USA West Coast and Sarajevo. So it's something just that you need to manage to, usually by people from USA coming to work a bit earlier, people from here staying a bit later to get those things done. There's no other way around it. You're either gonna do those things and find a way to do it, or you more or less cannot do Scrum or any kind of Agile. Okay. Anything else? Sure.
What about career in Scrum? As I recall correctly, there are some implementations of Scrum which mention producer role, who is not a team member, but a role who is in charge of driving the vision of the product and leading career management.
By the book Scrum, by the Scrum Guide by Ken Schwaber, doesn't really have any other roles than these ones. Anything else, and I've seen some of the implementations based on Scrum of different Agile methodologies. Anything else is extension of a framework, so you can do it. There's nothing forbidding you to do it, but it's not defined by a process, defined by a framework, and it's open to implementation. There are some good ideas in a book that was mentioned by one of the lecturers this morning. It's called Management 3.0 by Jürgen Appello, about how to manage teams, how to handle teams, empowering team members, motivations, intrinsic versus extrinsic motivations, stuff like that. So,
Scrum by the book doesn't say.
Scrum by the book is more or less a Scrum guide, which is like 15-page document that you can download off of Scrum.org or Scrum Alliance pages, and pretty much all of the definitions that we showed here are straight out of that guide. So the purpose of it was to be lightweight, not to cover the grounds for everything, not to meddle into stuff like human resources and career development. It's a process to actually develop a product. Career development and HR, again, and management are completely different science than SDLC. Okay. Any other questions?
Could you
Sure.
give an example of project types that are a good fit for Scrum and those that are not? That you come
Sure.
in the trenches or not?
Project types that Scrum. Probably the best fit that you'll get is a continuous project, kind of a project that isn't really fixed by scope and by budget. Something that's being done by more or less fixed set of developers or resources or whatever we want to call them. I hate the word resources, but it's usually used in literature. But those are mostly the projects that are best fit for Scrum, because what you end up with is iterative planning, adaptation, continuous adaptation, and there is no true end date because product backlog is a living artifact. It's being changed all the time, every day by product owner, by influence of stakeholders, even by adding bugs into it or defects. Projects that are bad for Scrum, probably something that's really small, really short term, because establishing the entire Scrum process for something that's going to take 2 guys 1 month to do is probably a huge overhead. Okay, anybody else? No? Thank you.